Welcome back. We are closing this one out with the stuff people argue about the most. Protein, fiber, weight loss, sleep, alcohol, supplements, and the modern health obsession circus. And somehow it all comes back to your gut microbes being the real audience. Protein powder is the funniest one, because people treat it like oxygen. That is exactly the energy. Like if you miss a scoop, the gym gods file a complaint. Most people just need better food, not more tubs of flavored promises. That fiber point is the real knife twist, though, because everybody's chasing protein and ignoring the thing they actually lack. Fiber is the unsexy celebrity nobody invites but everyone needs. And the numbers on ultra-processed food were wild, because the problem is not subtle anymore. Once the diet gets too processed, everything else starts wobbling. People want one magic hack, and health keeps refusing to be hacked. That's the whole business model ruined right there. Even the weight loss conversation was basically a demolition job on lazy advice. For extreme obesity, sure, dramatic tools can make sense. But for everybody else, the message was basically stop pretending this is a 6-week summer project. The 6-week summer project line is so evil because it's so true. The point was sustainability over spectacle. And then he just nuked calorie counting as a universal strategy. Gym culture did not enjoy that sentence. But honestly, the argument is strong because if appetite rebounds every time, what exactly are you counting for? It becomes a moral ritual instead of a workable system. And the exercise piece was the same thing, right? Incredible for health, not a clean fat loss lever. People hate that because they want the treadmill to behave like a refund machine. But his point was that appetite rises, metabolism adapts, and your brain starts negotiating. Your brain is such a fraud in those moments. The supplement section was brutal too, because so many homes are basically tiny warehouses of optimism. Tiny warehouses of optimism is insane. His basic position was that most supplements are unnecessary unless there is a real deficiency or real need. Which makes sense because if the diet is good, the supplement story gets much smaller. Calcium and vitamin D especially got dragged hard. Not because they are never useful, but because people turn them into universal mythology. Also because the marketing is doing backflips for no reason. Omega-3 got a similar reality check, which is annoying if you've been feeding it for years. Feeding it for years is such a funny way to say you took fish oil obediently. Then alcohol came up. And that was interesting because the tone was less preachy than people expect. Basically, if you do not drink, don't start for health reasons. And if you do drink, small amounts may sit in a narrow zone, but the overall trend is still not friendly. The red wine loophole is always trying to sneak back in like a little raccoon. A very sophisticated raccoon with vineyard branding. The more interesting part was the idea of almost zero alcohol wines and fermented plants. That felt like one of those future health ideas that might actually stick. Then sleep got linked straight into metabolism, mood, and cravings. That bit about the same food spiking your sugar more after bad sleep is a huge deal, because it means tiredness is not just a feeling, it's a metabolic state. And that consistency point was everywhere again. Same sleep timing, same rhythm, less chaos. Bodies really do hate your weekend personality. Mine absolutely does. Mine files complaints by Sunday night. Meal timing got treated almost like a second clock, which is a big shift from older thinking. Light matters, but food timing is clearly part of the circadian conversation now. That jet lag advice was practical too, because people obsess over sunlight and ignore the meal schedule. The plain fasting thing is such a weirdly elite survival tactic. Like, congratulations, you are now a spreadsheet with legs. But he also pushed back on obsession, which I liked. Because once health turns into anxiety, the whole thing gets counterproductive. The pet food section was unexpectedly great, because dogs are basically living case studies in processed food culture. French bulldogs are already cursed enough without industrial pellets. The idea that whole food diets help pets live better and gain less weight is very believable. And then the scale of Zoe made the whole thing feel bigger, because data changes conviction. Thousands of new microbes, new patterns, maybe even future therapies, that's huge. Not in a flashy marketing way, but in a real science way. The philosophy answer at the end was probably the cleanest summary of the whole series. Think about what your gut microbes would want. That one line basically collapses half the confusion. It also makes you weirdly respectful before you eat a snack. Like, hold on, Would my microbes be embarrassed by this? And then that final masculinity question landed surprisingly well. The answer was basically flexibility, shared responsibility, and less attachment to old stereotypes. Which feels right because young men are obviously dealing with a weird identity moment. The old script is cracking, and nobody handed out a better one yet. So the real advice was to stay male, but stay adaptable. That feels like a good place to land the whole series. We went from gut microbes to masculinity, and somehow it still felt coherent. That is the most podcast sentence imaginable. But honestly, the through line was simple. Stop chasing noise and pay attention to what your body actually responds to. Better food, better rhythm, less obsession. That is the series, that is the argument, and that is the note we leave on. We'll see you next time, and hopefully your microbes will approve. Welcome back. This is the last stretch, and we're tying together gut health, weight, sleep, and the big picture. And honestly, the whole thing keeps coming back to one annoying truth. The simple hacks are usually the bad ones. The internet hates that answer because it wants a miracle in a capsule. The miracle is apparently eating plants and going to bed on time, which is offensive to every supplement aisle ever built. It really is funny how much of the health industry depends on making the obvious sound complicated. Protein powders got treated like a personality trait for a while. Bro, people were acting like they were forging a contract with their biceps. And meanwhile, the real shortage was fiber, which is almost never sexy enough to trend. Nobody posts a photo of a beetroot bowl and says, "New era unlocked." But that was the uncomfortable point, right? That most people do not need more protein supplements. They need better food, more plant diversity, and way less ultra-processed nonsense. Which is such a boring prescription that people keep trying to escape it. The part that hit me hardest was the 30 plants a week idea. That sounds way harder than it is, but it also sounds way more powerful than calorie counting. Calorie counting has this cult following because it feels measurable. But if the food is garbage, the math is basically decorative. Decorative math is brutal but accurate. The weird part is that even exercise gets misused in the same way. People think a treadmill session cancels a broken diet. The body is not a refund department. That is such a savage line, but yes. Exercise is amazing, just not as a magic eraser for weight loss. And I think that distinction matters because people feel betrayed when it does not work. Right, and then they blame themselves instead of the strategy. Which is where the whole yo-yo cycle starts, and that's the trap. The body gets hungrier, the mind gets frustrated, and the whole thing becomes a loop. That's why the GLP-1 drugs came up as such a serious exception. For extreme obesity, they're not a hack, they're a medical intervention. And that framing matters because people keep talking about them like they're lifestyle accessories. That is the most insane part to me. If someone's health risk is that high, side effects become a different calculation. But for people who are basically fine and just want to trim a little, it's a bad trade. You do not need to chemically silence your appetite because of a beach photo. That should be printed on a billboard somewhere. The supplement conversation felt like the same story in a different costume. Some people genuinely need vitamin D, especially with low sunlight or darker skin in certain climates. But the idea that everyone should be swallowing capsules all day is just marketing with a lab coat. And calcium was the one that surprised me most because it has this wholesome reputation. But bolting nutrients into your system in giant doses is not the same as eating real food. That was the phrase that stuck with me, that food distribution matters as much as food content. Natural absorption beats dramatic dosing almost every time, which is bad news for every company selling certainty in a bottle. Alcohol was interesting because the tone was not moral panic, it was just clarity. Basically, if you do not drink, you are not missing a health secret. That alone will annoy a lot of dinner tables, especially the waiter who thinks pushing a bottle is charisma. But the larger point was that fermentation is the interesting part, not ethanol. Which is why the idea of nearly zero alcohol wine felt kind of futuristic. If you can keep the plant benefits and drop the poison, that is a real upgrade. Sleep got me too, because it connects to everything without ever acting dramatic about it. One bad night and your sugar response changes, your cravings change, your mood changes. So your breakfast can basically become a different event, depending on sleep. Exactly, and consistency matters more than people want it to. Nobody wants to hear that the weekend chaos is quietly punishing them. The body is such a petty accountant. And meal timing may be more powerful than sunlight for circadian rhythm, which is wild. I used to think light was the whole story, and now that sounds incomplete. Food is telling the clock what time it is. Which is a terrifying sentence if you love midnight snacks. Guilty, honestly. What I liked is that it never turned into obsession, even when the science got precise. The warning kept coming back that structure is good, but anxiety is not the goal. That felt important, because a lot of wellness advice becomes another prison. Friends, fun, flexibility, all of that still matters. And then the dog thing was absurdly useful, because it made the whole ultra-processed argument impossible to dodge. When your pet food looks like human junk food, the mirror gets very uncomfortable. Dogs and cats are probably getting the same metabolic punishment we are, which is hilarious and depressing at the same time. Then the big zoo of data came in, and suddenly this was not theory anymore. Hundreds of thousands of people, food diaries, gut patterns, new species, new links. That scale changes what science can even notice. It turns advice from guesswork into pattern recognition. And the conviction was not about one magic food, it was about the ecosystem. Your microbes are part of the decision whether you like it or not. That sentence makes every snack feel like a committee meeting. And that was the final principle, really. Eat for the system, not the slogan. That is probably the cleanest takeaway of the whole series. Not perfection, not punishment, just better inputs and more consistency. And a little less ego about being the exception to biology, which is rude but fair. I think that's a good final word for the whole run. If the series did anything, it hopefully made health feel more practical and less theatrical. And maybe a little less lonely too, because everybody is fighting the same bad incentives. We really did go from microbes to masculinity and somehow land somewhere useful. A miracle of modern podcasting. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us. And if your microbes are happy, honestly, we're calling that a win. Welcome back. This is the final one, and we're ending on gut health, weight, sleep, and the stuff nobody wants to hear. And somehow it all comes back to the same boring truth. Your daily habits are doing the heavy lifting. Which is annoying because everybody wanted a hack, not a calendar. The supplement aisle has been living rent-free in people's heads for years. The market is basically, you are failing but with packaging. That is exactly the scam energy. And the crazy thing is the big win is still food quality, not pill quality. The protein supplement obsession is such a good example of that. Most people are not protein-starved, they are fiber-starved. Nobody is filming a dramatic ad for beans and lentils, though. Exactly. There's no shirtless guy opening a tin of chickpeas in slow motion. But the fiber story is the real one if you zoom out. Because it's not just digestion, it's the whole microbiome ecosystem. Right, and once that ecosystem is off, everything starts getting weird. Which is tragic, because then people blame their willpower instead of their lunch. That line should be on a billboard somewhere. I also thought the chewing gum and mouthwash part was sneaky, because it sounds harmless, even virtuous, like you're doing hygiene cosplay. Hygiene cosplay is criminally accurate. But the point is that constant sweetness and constant blasting chemicals may be shaping your microbes. And people think fresh breath automatically means healthy breath. Fresh is not the same as functional. That's kind of the whole theme, actually. The thing that feels good right now is often not the thing that pays off later. Which is why the weight loss conversation got so spicy. People really hate hearing that calories are not the whole story. They hate it because it sounds like you're taking away the spreadsheet and the moral victory. But the argument was pretty clear. Food quality matters more than raw calorie math for most people. And if you are using the calorie model forever, you're often just building a rebound. That yo-yo loop is brutal because people think they failed personally. When the system is built to make hunger louder, failure is almost baked in. That's why the appetite drugs are such a big deal for extreme obesity. Not because they're magic, but because they change the appetite signal instead of fighting it forever. But that's also exactly why they shouldn't be treated like casual lifestyle accessories. If you only need to lose the last 7 vanity pounds, maybe don't bring out the nuclear option. The last 7 vanity pounds is such a savage phrase. And exercise got dragged into the same confusion. People want it to be the weight loss answer because it feels noble. But for many people, it increases hunger enough to cancel the math. So the treadmill becomes a negotiation with the donut. A very dishonest negotiation. The better framing is that exercise is amazing for brain, heart, and longevity. Just not as your main weight loss weapon. Exactly, because diet is the easier lever when the environment is full of ultra-processed food. And that's where the whole culture gets weird, because people keep acting like processed food is neutral. It's not neutral if it's making you hungrier, sleepier, and more addicted to sweetness. The supplement industry loves that confusion, by the way. Keep the food bad, sell the fix. That is basically the business model in one sentence. The vitamin talk was interesting because there are real exceptions, but the average person is not broken in a capsule-shaped way. Vitamin D for specific groups makes sense, especially with low sun exposure. But calcium and broad multivitamins were getting absolutely no romance at all. He looked like he wanted to personally throw the calcium bottle out the window. Fair, because people treat bones like they're built from enthusiasm and tablets. The alcohol section was also very clean, because the answer was basically, you do not need it. Which is strange, because socially we act like alcohol is almost mandatory. That waiter energy was so invasive too, like your sobriety offended the room. And yet the data is still uncomfortable for drinkers, because more alcohol means more disease risk. The only tricky part is that tiny window where some red wine data looks better. But tiny windows are not a life strategy. Nobody should be optimizing their liver around a romantic myth. That's another billboard line. Sleep was the quiet giant in all of this, though, because one bad night changes how you handle sugar, hunger, and cravings the next day. That part always hits people, because it feels immediate and personal. And the consistency piece is huge. Same sleep time, same wake time, same rhythms. It sounds almost unsexy, which is probably why it works. The most effective advice is always the least cinematic. Meal timing had that same vibe, especially around jet lag and circadian rhythm. Food is not just fuel, it's a clock signal. That idea feels bigger and bigger the more you think about it. Which means the assistant scheduling workouts and meals idea is useful, but only up to a point. Right, because obsession can turn a good system into another stress machine. I liked that he kept saying 80-20, not perfect control. That's what makes the whole philosophy livable. Then the pet food bit was funny but also weirdly important. Because dogs are basically getting the human processed food treatment with extra loyalty. And if whole foods help humans, it's not shocking they help animals too. The final huge point was the scale of their data and what it makes possible. 4,000 new microbes is wild. That's not tweaking the edges anymore. That's new terrain for health, diagnosis, maybe even treatment response. Which is why the final principle landed so well. Think on behalf of your microbes, because they're part of the system whether you like it or not. It's weirdly wholesome advice for something so microscopic. And then the masculinity question came in like a left hook. From bacteria to masculinity is an absurd jump, but it worked. The answer was less about macho performance and more about flexibility, sharing, and adapting. That feels right for this moment, honestly. Men are getting hit from a lot of sides, and old stereotypes are not helping them. Being male without being trapped by the old script is the whole challenge. And that's a pretty strong place to end a 3-part series, if I'm honest. We started with microbes and ended with identity, which is a very normal podcast shape. Totally standard human trajectory. Thanks for staying with us through all 3 episodes. If this made health feel less theatrical and more practical, we did our job. And if your microbes are happier now, that's a ridiculous but real win. We'll take ridiculous and real. See you next time. Welcome back. This one is the big wrap-up on gut health, weight, sleep, and the final philosophy. And honestly, it all keeps collapsing back into one annoying truth. Boring habits beat shiny hacks. Which is terrible for content and amazing for humans. The chewing gum and mouthwash thing is such a weird opener, though, because it sounds harmless. That little minty lie can apparently annoy your microbes all day. The brain just wants the blast of sweet and fresh, and your body pays the bill later. That is such a nasty trade if the payoff is just fake freshness. And that links straight into the bigger theme. People keep chasing quick signals instead of real nourishment. Like protein supplements being treated like a personality trait. Bro, protein marketing has convinced people their lunch is emotionally inadequate. For most people, the gap is fiber, not another tub of powder. That part is actually huge because fiber sounds boring until you realize it is the whole engine. Everyone is over here counting protein grams like it is a religion. Meanwhile, the gut is sitting there begging for plants, nuts, seeds, and variety. The 30 plants a week idea is so unsexy that it becomes powerful. It is the anti-hack hack. Weight loss is where it gets even more annoying because everyone wants a clean rule. And the answer is basically that sustainability matters more than drama. Except for people with serious obesity, where the situation is actually medical. Right. And that is where the drugs and surgery become tools, not lifestyle accessories. The internet heard that and immediately tried to turn it into a cheat code. Which is exactly the problem, because minor vanity weight is not the same emergency. He was basically saying, if your risk is huge, accept side effects and act aggressively. But if you are mostly fine, improve diet quality first and stop obsessing over calories. That calories in, calories out thing got absolutely cooked in this conversation. He looked at calorie counting like it was a quaint historical hobby. The point was not that energy balance is fake, but that human behavior makes the simple model useless. Hunger just fights back every time you try to brute force it. And exercise gets trapped in the same mess because people use it as punishment for diet. He was clear that exercise is brilliant for brain and heart, just not a great weight loss weapon by itself. Which is so insulting to gym culture that I almost respect it. Your treadmill is not a confession booth. The supplement section was brutal too, because he basically said most of it is marketing. Some people need vitamin D, some need real deficiency correction, but the average person does not need a shelf. Calcium pills being treated like bone insurance was probably the most inconvenient part. Especially because the evidence now points to food, not capsules, and too much supplemental calcium may even hurt. Imagine paying for a health habit that might just annoy your heart. Omega-3 got dragged too, unless you are in a very specific medical situation. The supplement industry must hear this and immediately need a lie down. Alcohol was interesting because the stance was simple, which made it stronger. Basically, if you do not drink, you are not missing a health necessity. The red wine exception is tiny and messy, which is very on-brand for nutrition science. And the future fantasy is low-alcohol wine that keeps the plant benefits without the damage. Sleep and meal timing felt like the quietest, massive insight in the whole episode. Because a bad night of sleep changes the next day's sugar response, hunger, and cravings. So your breakfast can hit harder just because you slept badly. Exactly, and that is why consistency matters more than heroic weekend behavior. He even pushed the idea that meal timing can matter more than light for circadian rhythm in some cases. Which is annoying because the body keeps refusing to be a one-variable machine. The dog food bit was funny until it wasn't because pets get the same ultra-processed trap. Your dog is basically eating the same industrial nonsense with a tail attached. And then the Zoe data part turned into this massive science frontier. Finding thousands of new microbes and maybe predicting disease risk is genuinely wild. The final principle was almost offensively elegant. Think about your microbes first. If the microbes would be happier with it, that is probably the better move. And then that masculinity question at the end just came out swinging. Suddenly we went from fiber to gender roles in one clean pivot. His answer was basically flexibility, shared responsibility, and less obsession with old stereotypes. Which feels right, especially when young men are clearly struggling in a lot of ways. So the whole series ended up saying the same thing in different costumes. Stop fighting biology and start working with it. Less performative health, more lived health. That should be the slogan on every supplement aisle. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us. If this made one person eat more plants and fewer lies, we are calling it a win. And if your microbes are thriving, that is the weird little victory we wanted. We will catch you in the next one.